Hello, I'm Cameo George, executive producer of American Experience, PBS's flagship and longest running history series. Thank you for joining us. Past Forward Conversations with American Experience is our monthly virtual conversation series where we discuss the themes explored in our films with historians and experts. Today's Past Forward conversation explores the evolution of fertility science from a niche opportunity to an accepted norm. It is inspired by our film Test Tube Babies, now available to stream in full on our website, americanexperience.org, and on the PBS video app for a limited time. Test Tube Babies tells the story of doctors, researchers, and hopeful couples who push the limits of science, triggering a technological revolution in human reproduction. Today, our guests will discuss women taking their reproductive rights into their own hands, the many pathways to parenthood that exist today, and the ongoing work to remove the stigmas and barriers that stand in the way of building families. As always, this is meant to be an interactive conversation. I invite you to write questions in the live chat and we'll answer as many as possible during the discussion. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge our corporate sponsors, Liberty Mutual Insurance and Consumer Cellular. I'd also like to acknowledge the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, the Documentary Investment Group, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, PBS, our home station, GBH, and of course, viewers like you. Now, I'm happy to introduce our panel for this conversation. Elizabeth Carr is the first ever baby born via in vitro fertilization in the United States. In the public eye since she was 3 cells old, Elizabeth is a passionate advocate for those fighting for fertility rights. From battles over insurance coverage to educating doctors on how to interact with patients going through infertility treatments, to advice for parents on how to talk to children about assisted reproductive technologies, Elizabeth is proud to share her voice and her story in order to fight for those who may not be able to fight for themselves. Margaret Marsh is a professor at Rutgers University. She has been researching and writing about the history of infertility, reproductive medicine, and reproductive technology for the past 3 decades. She is the co-author of 3 books on these subjects, most recently, The Pursuit of Parenthood, Reproductive Technology from Test Tube Babies to Uterus Transplants. Our moderator for today's conversation is Monica Muñoz Martinez. She is a professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin, and she's a genius, AKA the winner of a 2021 MacArthur Foundation grant. Thank you again, and please enjoy the conversation.
Thank you, Cameo. Welcome, Elizabeth and Margaret. It's great to talk with you today about how fertility science evolved from a niche opportunity to an accepted norm, and how women are taking their reproductive rights into their own hands with these technologies. For ages, the prospect of conceiving a human being in a laboratory seemed ludicrous, even impossible. Today, many women are waiting longer to start families, and fertility science is part of the calculus. Let's start at the beginning. Margaret, can you talk to us about some of the challenges faced by early researchers in the 1970s trying to crack the code of conception? What were some of the critical breakthroughs, and who were some of the key players?
So this is so interesting. I used to think that the 1970s were kind of dull when it came to IVF. Nothing's going on, and then finally you have baby Louise. But that was before my sister, and my sister's my research collaborator. That's before the two of us started working on our most recent book, which is a history of assisted reproduction. And we found that the 1970s were pretty interesting. For me, it was, okay, so John Rock, Mary Mencken, they fertilized some eggs in 1944. That's the first time human eggs were fertilized outside the human body. And then kind of nothing happened. As John Rock said, not so hard to get them fertilized, but it's pretty hard to figure out the next steps. And so in the 1970s, they were trying to figure out the next steps. The first people who took those next steps were Robert Edwards and Patrick Steptoe, and they published an article in 1969 that showed the sperm going right into the egg. So it's like the first stages of fertilization. And that was a really, really big deal. They too had trouble getting to the next step. And they kept trying different things, and they weren't getting any pregnancies, and meanwhile, the Australians down there in Melbourne, led by Carl Wood, they had been inspired by this 1969 article, sperm going into the egg. And they got a pregnancy in 1973. It was a very short-lived pregnancy, but they got a pregnancy. So all of a sudden you have this horse race going on. Who's going to get it? Australians or the British? Australians or the British? So 1975, Steptoe and Edwards, by now joined by Jean Purdy, they get a pregnancy, and they're, yay, we're going to have the first baby. And it was an ectopic pregnancy. But at least now they knew that they could get a real pregnancy. So you might be wondering, what's going on in the United States? Well, in the United States, research was stalled. We'll get to some of the policy implications later, but research was stalled because of various controversies over whether they should be doing it, should they be doing more animal research, and also in 1975, the federal government decided that there was going to be a moratorium on any federal funding of research. So the Americans are kind of holding back until there's going to be federal funding, because that's the research environment that they're used to living in. And then Howard and Georgiana Jones are forced to retire. They used to make professors retire at the age of 65, and they only let Howard Jones stay around for 2 years because he was working in his wife's lab and wasn't taking up any space of his own. But when she turned 65, they were forced to retire from Hopkins. They had had incredibly distinguished careers doing various things in reproductive medicine, and both of them were extremely well known and very well respected. And meanwhile, down in Virginia, there's a guy named Mason Andrews who's building a new medical school. And he figures, how am I going to get this medical school on the map? Hire a couple of really distinguished researchers and turn them loose on anything they want to do. So Howard and Georgiana are driving down to Virginia from Maryland in 1978 to take up their new jobs when the announcement of the birth of Louise Brown comes out. So Steptoe and Edwards had finally succeeded. And this is a very famous story about the Joneses. They're surrounded by their packing boxes and besieged by reporters saying, could we do it here? Could we do it here? And Howard Jones says, yeah, all it would take would be a little money. Of course, I think he and Georgiana were thinking about doing it already because they had hosted Bob Edwards in their lab in the 1960s and had in a way kind of mentored him. And I think they were thinking about doing it already, but I don't think Elizabeth does. So they began immediately. One of Georgiana's patients gave them some funding, and their institution down there in Virginia, where the anti-abortion movement was rampant, and they kept trying to stop them. Their institution stood by them, and so they had institutional support. They had private funding. By the time they got started with their clinic, they had 2,500 people asking for IVF. By the time Elizabeth was on her way, they had more than 5,000. So there was clearly a demand for this. And meanwhile, the Australians finally had their first birth in 1980, but in the United States, the first birth came to the Joneses, and the first baby is right here with us. So the research was really interesting. The challenges were amazing, but it took people who weren't afraid. They weren't worried about their federal funding for something else because they were retired. They had private funding. Took people who weren't afraid. And then once they opened up their clinic, it broke the dam. Is that what I'm saying? Broke
Yes.
the dam. Open the floodgates.
Thank you. And for putting it into context of all of the different elements that were right there at the right moment for Elizabeth to join us. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. This film really tells your story. What does it mean to be America's first baby born using IVF technology? What was it like growing up with a celebrity? And how are you also uniquely positioned to advocate for others today?
Well, thanks for having me, first of all. And, it's been interesting being a first, right? So it's always difficult if you're the first of something. It's often something that people don't understand. And I have been under media scrutiny since I was very, very young. My first, we jokingly call it my first baby photo in my family was at 3 cells old under a Nikon microscope. Which is still in use today, actually, the model microscope. And my first press conference was at 3 days old. So I've always existed in this world of media attention. And I think I had a jump on a lot of children having to understand how I was brought into the world a lot sooner than other children might have that reproductive talk, right? So, it was a lot of pressure. It wasn't pressure that my parents put on me, but I very clearly understood that I needed to be articulate. I needed to come out looking normal. I think if I hadn't, I don't think IVF would have been so widely accepted in the United States as quickly as it was.
There's some striking images of your mother holding you and being wheeled, in front of the media, and I'm just thinking, this is not long after delivery.
Yes.
And so just to think about your first photograph, first media appearance being 3 days old, and then this image of the first 3 cells being your first photograph. So what does that mean about, your role in being able to be an advocate for others today, your perspective and your understanding of issues related to IVF?
Sure. So my 9 to 5 gig is actually as a patient advocate. And I've actually always thought of myself as a patient advocate, even when I didn't officially have the title. So I like to say that I'm science adjacent. I'm very fascinated by everything going on in science, but I am a writer and journalist through and through. And so I've always thought of it as part of my role to explain and break down these very hard to understand complex ideas surrounding reproduction and all of those issues to patients, because my parents only knew about IVF and this procedure because somebody took 2 seconds to say, there was this thing in England. I don't know much about it, but here's a brochure, go learn about it. And it might be something you want to pursue. And so if they hadn't taken that second to educate my parents, who knows where I would be? I wouldn't be here. And so for me, it's always coming down to, I'm not going to tell somebody what is the right thing for them to do, but I want to help them learn what the landscape of all of the different options are.
Great, thanks. We learn in the film that, go ahead. Did you want to add something?
Elizabeth a question? I really love your term science adjacent, because, now for the last 3 decades, my sister's Wanda Ronner, she's a gynecologist, and I know I'm a historian, and I started out as a historian of gender in the family, and then we started doing this, and I feel science adjacent too. I've learned the language of medicine, more medicine adjacent, I guess. Learn the language of medicine, but it's a great term, and I'm going to steal it from.
You're welcome to.
Great. We learn in the film that early fertility science advancements were not accepted by the general public. I think this idea of translating what was actually happening into science really rings large in the film. Let's watch a clip now to learn more about why the science was not accepted first early on by the general public.
In 1960, Sheddles published Ovum Humanum, a photographic atlas showing microscopic human eggs, called oocytes, in early stages of development.
They were unique. Here were human oocytes, sperm one had seen, but many of us had worked with mice and cows and sheep and monkeys and species of that sort, but to see human was very exciting, really thrilling photographs.
Throughout the 1960s, Sheddles struggled to grow an embryo until it was large enough to reinsert into the womb. Then, in 1969, he was stunned to learn that 2 British researchers were racing ahead of him. After a series of breakthroughs, physiologist Robert Edwards and gynecologist Patrick Steptoe were ready to implant embryos into women's bodies. Test tube babies were no longer a fantasy. They were on the horizon. Many Americans were horrified.
The idea that you could take a human embryo, which you've created in the petri dish, which is already very unnatural and abnormal, and then take that embryo and put it back into a woman's uterus and have a baby born was appalling to most people. Even to scientists and most other doctors, it felt uncomfortable.
There was a real belief that if you were going to mess around with eggs and sperm in a petri dish and make a baby, that you could do some real chromosomal damage and create monsters.
Even testing in animals wouldn't really, at the end, tell us whether this would be safe in humans. So there were some people who were warning that we simply shouldn't go down this road. Many people were concerned, will we come to see the technological production of children as, in fact, superior in the long run, because in the newfangled, brave new world, we will be in a position to ensure that unhealthy or imperfect children are not born?
Well, I think there was a fear of the slippery slope, that if it would work for infertile couples, then maybe people would start to say, hey, I'd like to have a smart baby or an athletic baby or some other desirable kind of traits in my baby. And if you could pick the sperm and the egg, then maybe that's the way that we'll all have babies. It was about eugenics. It was about making super babies, perfect babies, better babies.
Margaret, as a historian of this science and technology, can you tell us what do you think, where is the line between interfering with nature and aiding it? Is there a line that should not be crossed? Are there limits to this evolution that should be considered?
Sure. I mean, this is really, really interesting because there are always lines that people think shouldn't be crossed. But in the 1970s, we didn't have a baby yet. And so people were speculating, and some people thought that the babies would be born with genetic disorders. And then there were other people who said, cynically, we already have too many people in the world. Why do we want to make new ones? And then some of the most vociferous opposition to IVF, and who said, here's the line that should never be crossed. We should not do this. Were the very vocal members of the anti-abortion movement. They said some embryos will be destroyed if we use IVF, and destroying an embryo is murder, and therefore we absolutely cannot ever use IVF. So to different people, there were different lines. And then, of course, there's always the slippery slope argument. IVF today, designer babies tomorrow. So crossing the line was different for different people. But before there were babies, there was a lot more anxiety.
Let's pivot a bit and talk about how this research was funded. In the early days, the government would not fund this research, and the breakthroughs were left to private clinics. Your birth, Elizabeth, inspired a surge of private medical clinics to go ahead with the research without federal funding. Let's watch a short clip from the film that speaks to this and how fertility science became so widely accepted in such a short period of time.
When Elizabeth Carr was born, it emboldened other medical centers to go ahead and start up their own IVF clinics and to say to the federal government, we're not going to worry about getting your money for this. We're going to risk it.
Over the next 2 decades, Howard and Georgiana Jones would continue to perfect in vitro fertilization and train the first generation of IVF doctors in the United States.
Okay.
By 1985, 115 children owed their existence to the Joneses.
The first baby reunion was perhaps the most special to me. The staircase was just filled with parents holding their babies. And to see all those couples with those beautiful babies, that's the first time it hit me just what had happened over the course of the past 5 years.
It was a little surprising how quickly people got used to IVF. But not really if you think about how people get used to all sorts of new technology. That's sort of the pattern that it takes, is that at first it seems like it's abhorrent and it's something that we absolutely shouldn't do. And then for a while it seems kind of miraculous. And then after a while, the technology just becomes part of the fabric of daily life.
Elizabeth, how is fertility science funded today? In some states, health insurance will cover IVF, right? That's my understanding, that there are some states that do and some that don't. Why is this important, and what coverage gaps exist, and how do they impact different populations?
Sure. So this is a very complex question. So I'm going to try and explain it in the simplest terms that I can. So essentially, since there was no federal funding, it was left up to the states to decide if they were going to mandate insurance companies cover infertility treatments. And so in the United States, currently, there are only 19 states actually that have some form of mandate requiring insurance companies to cover reproductive technologies. And, you know, if you pull back the lens a little bit and look at us compared to other countries, for example, Sweden, where couples can go through IVF and have fully funded by the government cycles paid for, you know, we're in a very different environment than some other countries. And so it really does vary, and it depends, you know, entirely on you know, the political machines at work, and, you know, who is kind of controlling and how hard the lobby is there. Wouldn't you agree, Margaret?
Yes, I totally agree. I live in a state that does cover IVF, and I actually know people who moved to New Jersey to work for New Jersey companies in order to get coverage for IVF.
Wow. So if you could elaborate, Margaret, too, on access, and this is, of course, tied up with all of the swirling legislation today to restrict women's reproductive rights. Why is it so important for women to take these rights into their own hands? And is it possible for every woman to do that?
Yeah, so this is one of Dr. Ronners, my research collaborator, Dr. Ronners, and my big worries is that there are so many women who won't be able to take these rights into their own hands. I mean, assisted reproductive technology is expensive, and as Elizabeth said, you know, in most of the country, people have to pay for it themselves. Medicaid does not cover IVF. Medicaid does not cover many aspects of reproductive medicine. And healthcare is a human right, I would argue. And fertility care is a part of healthcare. And so in this society, Black women and other women of low income are much more likely to experience infertility than the women of the upper middle class that, you know, we see profiled in the media all the time. And they have a bigger problem, and yet their situation often goes unnoticed. And so I'm with Elizabeth. I think that the United States should emulate the rest of the developed world when it comes to healthcare, including fertility care. We ought to be covering fertility care. We ought to be covering it under Medicaid, and we ought to be covering it under insurance. And I also worry that the increasing influence of the anti-abortion movement may have another impact on assisted reproduction, because embryos are destroyed in assisted reproduction. This happens. Will there be restrictions on everyone's access to assisted reproduction in those states that are now poised, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, to legislate against abortion? This is going to be something we're going to have to watch.
Yeah, it's important. You're helping us to connect the dots to access to reproductive rights more broadly. You've also dedicated your career to researching the history of infertility, reproductive medicine, and reproductive technology for the past 3 years. So with the context all included, how much has the science evolved? What modern medicines and technologies are now available to aid infertility beyond IVF? And where do you see science going?
So I've been really interested in a lot of some of these newer technologies. And so these are some of the things I've been following that I've been really interested in. One is egg freezing. I've been interested in egg freezing both for medical reasons, people who are undergoing medical treatment that will affect their fertility, and elective reasons. I'm not ready to have a baby. And I'm interested not just in those who freeze their own eggs, but I'm also interested in the practice of using frozen donor eggs, because in the past, egg donors and recipients either knew each other or had a fair amount of knowledge about each other. And now, if people are buying their eggs, putting them in a basket, having them sent right to they're buying them from an egg brokerage, what's going to happen to that kind of relationship between egg donor and egg recipient? Is it going to be just like sperm donation, which is basically a transaction? So I'm interested in that. I've also been following uterus transplants with a lot of interest. And there are now successful uterus transplants from living donors and some from donors who have already passed. And I just think that this is going to be interesting going forward, because these are women who otherwise would have used surrogacy if they could to have a baby, who can now have their own baby. So that is really, really interesting. And I've also had a longstanding interest in pre-implantation genetic screening and genetic diagnosis. They've been around for a while, and they continue to cause controversy, but they do provide a level of reassurance to prospective parents, particularly those who have heritable genetic diseases. And so that's something. And I'm also interested in something that we are not allowed at this point to do in this country, although they do it in Great Britain. And that's something called mitochondrial replacement techniques that can be used for women who have heritable mitochondrial diseases. And I was very disappointed that a budget rider, which is of course how we make policy in this country about reproductive medicine, somebody attaches a rider to an appropriations bill. A budget rider has prohibited the FDA from considering any of these techniques that are recommended by the National Academy of Medicine. So these are some of the new things that I'm really interested to see how they go. Elizabeth, you got anything on your list?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always interested, you know, with patient advocacy, I do the transparency aspect of IVF. And so we're moving now to a model where you have closed circuit television that can monitor the chambers where your frozen eggs are being stored. There's going to be the ability to RFID chip your tissue samples so you can track them like almost like a package.
Wow.
And it really provides, you know, a greater level of transparency, which I think, you know, back when I was born was not even in the realm of possibility. So it's been fascinating to watch.
Oh, that is really, really interesting. And there are so many new technologies. They're more than this, but these are the ones that I'm finding particularly interesting and compelling to keep an eye on to see where they go.
Well, after 3 decades of tracking this, and you know, you're still excited by the next steps, and it sounds fascinating. But I think have questions too about IVF and you know, how many babies do we know have been born through IVF or other forms of fertility science in the U.S. since Elizabeth? In the world, do we have numbers? Or good statistics, Elizabeth? What numbers do you pull?
So in many ways, we've a little bit lost count because there have been so many. So the last figure that I heard was we have more than 8 million IVF babies in the world. My guess is that actually that's quite an outdated figure at this point because that's a couple years old. But it's you know, there's still points of moving data that we can't really wrap our arms around.
And Margaret,
one of the implications?
Oh, sorry.
One of the problems with that 8 million is China's not included and India's not included. So we don't know how many IVF babies are born in China and India, and we suspect probably a lot of them. So, you know, it says 8 million, the data says 8 million, I looked at another data point and said, oh, well, maybe it's as many as 9 million, about 1 million born in the United States, but it does give you a sense of kind of what we don't know. And in the US, we keep track as a result of the Wyden Act, we keep track of babies born using assisted reproductive technology. And what that means, those are all the technologies where eggs and sperm are handled outside the body. But, you know, there's other kind of medical technologies like babies born through sperm donation. And we have absolutely no idea how many babies have been born.
So just quickly, what are the implications of what we don't know?
Well, you know, I mean, now that people can go on ancestry.com and find all of these things about their ancestry, and they're finding out, well, gee, you know, I thought my father was my genetic father, but it turns out I had a sperm donor. In the old days, people didn't necessarily tell their kids that they were the products of sperm donation. Since we developed a technology in the 1990s called ICSI, intracytoplasmic sperm injection, was the first real treatment for male infertility. So before that, heterosexual couples were using sperm donation as well as single women and lesbian couples, and you know, and fathers often didn't want to tell their kids, well, you know, I couldn't produce a baby, so we got a sperm donor. And now you get all these people in their 70s finding out that their father was a sperm donor, and they don't keep track. You don't know how many babies were being created. The CDC during the Obama administration wanted to create something called an action plan for the study and diagnosis and treatment of infertility, but it fell by the wayside during the Trump administration. If it revived that action plan, there would be more efforts to collect the kind of data we should have to know how many people are using what you might call reproductive technology, but it's not covered under the Wyden Act. It's not called assisted reproductive technology. I'm always surprised at how much we don't know about certain things.
To that point, and what we don't know, it seems to fuel so much misunderstanding. Many of the early stigmas have receded as fertility science has become a norm, but there are still some stigmas around fertility, right? For example, women are considered to have a geriatric pregnancy once they turn 35. That terminology certainly sounds stigmatizing. So, what are in terms of thinking about the stigma here too, what about LGBTQ families? How does the science available support their options for having children, and how are the stigmas different? Elizabeth, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure.
I'm turning to the patient advocate here.
Yeah, I mean, I think now, again, it goes back to my earlier point of we really as a society have to keep talking about all of the options out there, because that's the way you break down a stigma, is to keep talking about it and educating the public about it. And I still, to this day, me of all people, have people coming up to me and saying in a hushed tone, oh, I know so-and-so who was an IVF baby, or, oh, my sister went through this, or, and it's still very hush, hush and quiet. And of course, if they tell me, I'm the boisterous, loud one in the room going, that's wonderful, that's excellent. But there are so many options out there, the surrogacy, egg donation, sperm donation, obviously we have third-party IVF now, which, is a whole other technology we didn't even touch on. So there are so many options now that the only way we can break down that stigma is to keep talking about them.
And of course, I live in the Philadelphia region, and every one of our IVF practices, sometimes they have special practices for gay and lesbian couples. I remember one of my graduate students, when my sister and I were working on our book, he came in and said, oh, I was at gay bingo. Gay bingo is a thing in Philly. I was at gay bingo. And so, your local bar comes in and does a spiel in between the bingo rounds. And coming in to do a spiel was Reproductive Medicine Associates to talk about their special work for gay and lesbian couples. And so in metropolitan areas, there is no stigma. These practices are very ready and able to help people. One of our alumni here is a surgeon who specializes in transgender surgery, and he was telling me that when Penn started to do their uterus transplants, his male patients were saying, can you transplant a uterus into my body? Well, you can't, because you have to hook the uterus up to all of these vessels that still exist. But there's not, it's a regular question. Whether that's true in certain parts of the country, it is not true. But certainly in metropolitan areas, these practices make a major effort to help everybody.
That's great. Well, we have questions pouring in from Facebook and on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and open it up to questions from the audience. Shane on Facebook asks, I would like to hear the panelists discuss fertility for transgender people, preserving fertility, how to go about conceiving in a non-dehumanizing way.
Yeah, so I'll tackle this one a little bit. I really think that the most important thing is doing your homework and finding a clinic and practitioner that really, you feel comfortable with. And this is one of the things that's often hard for many patients to come to terms with or grasp, that you don't need to stick with the first clinic that you work with. Many people will try one clinic, and even if they have success, something just didn't feel right or felt off. You have to really go through that vetting process, because you're going to be with these people for a long haul. And so, my biggest thing is, really kind of look into, talk to friends and family, see if they have recommendations, but also look at the data, look at if they're reporting to the CDC, look at the SART data. And if you don't know what those acronyms are, message me and I'll help you. So, that I think is step number one.
Thank you. That's terrific advice. Shamika on Facebook asks, please discuss karyotype research and why it is not prioritized when treating infertility.
Margaret, you want to take that?
I can't. No, I can't. I can't do that. I can't answer that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're both, as we said earlier, we're science adjacent. So, in terms of, karyotyping with pre-implantation genetic testing, I think you want to look at, if you are working with a clinic that is working with a lab that will do pre-implantation genetic testing, and what kind of pre-implantation genetic testing they do, because karyotyping may come into play if you go down that path. But it all comes down again to that conversation with your clinician and your IVF provider, whether that's something that you should have on your radar, and keep having those conversations, ask those questions. Those are the kinds of questions you really need to ask your provider.
Great advice. Monet on Facebook asks, do you think there is a disconnect between the research that is happening and the practice? I wonder if the clinics are as informed as they should be on the newer discoveries.
So I want to tackle this in a kind of indirect way. This is one of the problems of not having federal funding for research on assisted reproduction. Remember that moratorium of 1975 where they weren't going to fund it until the Ethics Advisory Board came into play and decided whether they could fund IVF research? Well, IVF research is still not funded. I mean, that moratorium is still in effect today. It's now enshrined in a budget rider every year. And so what this means for research is that research happens and standards of care are developed without having appropriate clinical trials. So no, not every clinic is up to date. And unfortunately, probably Elizabeth knows more about this than I do. The individual is left, or the couple is left, to look up the data from the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology. Who are the patients of this clinic? How what is their pregnancy rate? Because there are clinics that they don't even. You can have a clinic and not belong to the Society of Assisted Reproductive Technology and not report your data. And in my research of writing about clinics in the 90s and the 2000s, there are some clinics that are just not good, and that's the way it is. And the onus is unfortunately it's on the patient, and that's why we have wonderful patient advocates who help the patients to get through these things. One of my friends is a patient. Another friend is a patient advocate.
We have a lot of these questions are about access, and Louise on YouTube has a question about medical tourism. Does the limited access to and the high cost of assisted reproductive technology cause Americans to go to other countries for these treatments?
Yep, Absolutely. I know some very close personal friends that actually temporarily moved and had their treatments in another country where they had dual citizenship, and it's a very real thing. On the flip side of that, there are people who still come to the United States for access. So it's a wide spectrum when it comes to access, and it is by no means universal.
Thank you. Carrie on Facebook asks, as the technology advances, how do we keep the cost for prospective patients and parents in check? Is there anything that could be done to keep costs in check?
Sure, insurance. Mandated insurance for these procedures, because otherwise, no, if they're not going to be the way we do it now, except in the states that have really good insurance mandates, is kind of the way we do cosmetic surgery. You go and you pay. I mean, the only thing that keeps costs down is clinics competing with each other. And these are expensive technologies, but the professional organizations are very much in favor of insurance. I mean, the American Society of Reproductive Medicine is in favor of insurance mandates, and yeah, the only way you're going to keep the cost down is if we insure people, and that also democratizes these technologies so that people can afford them up and down the economic ladder, and that to me is very important.
I do want to just jump in and add, so that not all hope is lost, right? If you live in a state where insurance is not covered, there are resources out there for scholarships. There are organizations like Resolve that will actually help you, with lists of scholarships where you can apply for funds to cover IVF or other family planning and building. So, it is not a dark black hole out there for anybody. There is,
right.
There are resources.
Thank
You're
you.
right.
You said,
there are. It's just I don't think it's. I think it's just not fair that everybody.
Not sufficient. Sure.
Just to make sure I had that right, you said it was Resolve.
Yes, Resolve is the National Infertility Association, and they're just a wonderful resource, including helping you advocate for insurance benefits at your workplace and giving you a toolkit on how to do that. It's incredibly invaluable work.
Thank you. Shamika on Facebook asks, will the panelists also speak about egg donation and embryo adoption?
So the idea of embryo adoption is one of my total pet peeves. You cannot adopt an embryo. An embryo is not a child. You can use a donated embryo. You can buy an embryo, but you cannot adopt an embryo. This is language that has been put in place by the anti-abortion movement. The profession, the medical profession, does not use that language. Embryos can be donated, and you can use a donated embryo, and you can use it, and you can use a donor egg. The embryos that are donated to the places where they say you're having embryo adoption, if you are, quote, adopting those embryos, which means you're buying them, you are paying. They may be donated, but you are paying for them. And there are also places where you can get ready-made embryos. There is one practice in California, and I actually find this quite abhorrent, where they are just buying sperm and buying eggs and making embryos, and you can get those embryos. But yes, you can. That is. I think it's really lovely if you want to use a donated embryo, but it's not adoption. Sorry, this is my hobby, a hobby horse I have.
Heidi on Facebook asks, now that women are healthier than ever before, and quote, 40 is the new 30, can women safely and feasibly carry pregnancies in their 40s and 50s?
So this is one of those questions that I love. I love getting this question because it's really a conversation you need to have with your doctor, your clinician, because everybody's a different, unique snowflake. One of the benefits of IVF is that it gave women a sense that we could kind of outsmart the biological clock. But you also have to remember the flip side of that is that that's not always true. And although there have been successful pregnancies in their 40s and 50s and onward, that's not typically the norm. IVF is not successful necessarily on the first try. So you have to think if you're starting your first cycle in your late 40s, early 50s, and you might have to go through 5 cycles, where does that land you? What is your health going to look like in a few years? Things like that. But it's really a conversation you have to have with your clinician.
My sister and I take a slightly different position, which is, for the most part, women have been having children in their 40s for centuries. Usually, it's their last kid, not their first kid, and it seems from the data to be more or less safe to have a child in your 50s, but your chance of getting pregnant with your own eggs is very, very small, especially after the age of 43 or 44. So you can get pregnant with a donor egg. And, depending on it, Elizabeth's right, depending on if your doctor says it's safe to have a pregnancy in your 40s, then I think you could go ahead and have the pregnancy. Wanda and I kind of draw the line at the 50s. We think the data shows that the pregnancies tend to be just too dangerous for the mother.
Thank you for that long view. Effie on YouTube has a question. Effie asks, would love the panel to address how the technology might help people suffering from miscarriages.
Elizabeth, can you take that?
Sure. Yeah, again, this is another, you can look at what we call recurrent pregnancy loss, right? Which means that you might have had one or more miscarriages. And often that can be tied to an infertility diagnosis. So it could be any number of different things. And again, this is where working with a really skilled clinician who can help kind of pinpoint those things. We do have technology now and hormone treatments where you can get shots to help balance some of the hormones to prevent miscarriage, and really kind of have a reverse engineering kind of look at why you might have miscarried. It just depends on what the circumstances around your miscarriage were. Was it due to male factor infertility? Was it due to an inhospitable womb? What caused it? If it wasn't unexplained infertility, then IVF is definitely a line of defense there.
This is a follow-up question for Margaret. There are still so many mysteries regarding women's health, reproduction, and labor. What emerging science is needed or is on the horizon that could improve reproductive health and women's health?
Oh Lord, there are so many things that we could do to improve our reproductive health. One would be to do the kind of studies that we need to have done to improve women's health overall. I still think, to go back to the other question, there's still a lot we don't understand about miscarriages. There's a lot recurrent pregnancy loss, we don't really call them miscarriages anymore, but there are a lot we do know, but there's a lot that we still don't know. It would be interesting, it would be important to understand why in IVF, better understand why certain embryos implant and other ones don't. I mean, some of these things, and of course, many of these things would be much easier to study if we had funding from the National Institutes of Health to be able to study these things and then to do serious clinical trials. But we're not at the end of this road yet.
To that point, Elizabeth, how do we continue to remove the stigmas and barriers that stand in the way of building families today? And how does your advocacy support this work? You've already shown so much of what you do.
Sure. So, I mean, a lot of what I do is just, talking with people every day. And I think the fact that I'm a product of this technology allows me to kind of answer the questions that many people are afraid to ask. There are no dumb questions, especially when it comes to reproductive rights and technology and your options. And as I said, that's the way that we're going to continue to break down the stigma. And I think my personal goal has always been that many of these options are ones you don't know about until you're in the thick of infertility and you're dealing with it. And then at that point, you're making a decision when you're in crisis. And if you know about all of the different options before you even know that you need any intervention, that's going to give you a much better baseline of what might be the potential next step for you. And so again, it just all comes down to continuing to talk about everything, talk about the issues, talk about the financial burden, talk about the emotional and mental well-being, everything.
So we have just a couple of minutes left, and there's a big question that really, all of this raises a core question for me. Who should decide who gets to have children and when they should have them? And do women have control over their own bodies? Margaret, if you would start, and then I'll turn this over to Elizabeth. It's a big question, but
it's a big question. And so, if people want to read a lot about it, they could read my sister's and my book called The Pursuit of Parenthood, which is our most recent book. It's a history of assisted reproduction. But the short answer is different cultures decide. And in this culture, in the United States, what we have decided so far is that the marketplace decides, which means that individuals can decide if they have the access and the means to make that decision. I would prefer a society in which we had greater consensus about what was acceptable and what was not acceptable, a society in which we had a little more regulation, a society in which we had an American version of the British HIFA, which is the Society for, I can't remember what it stands for, but it's the regulatory body that exists in the UK, that where people should have a consensus about what is okay and what is not okay, and they make changes, and they've done this. But we don't do that in the United States. In the United States, unfortunately, for the most part, it is the marketplace that allows some people to have a lot of control over their reproductive lives and other people not to. And I think that's too bad.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I would agree on the whole with that sentiment. I think ultimately it comes down to every person's decision on what is right for them in terms of their comfort level. Now, whether they have access to that thing or that technology is an entirely different question. But I really think that it comes down to, especially like in my parents' case, they were pursuing adoption, and not having a biological family of their own was just not something that they thought was in the cards. And so they took a leap of faith and applied to this unknown program, and here we are. And so, I think if people can start there and figure out what they want, then we can all kind of rally and enact whatever change needs to occur to make that happen. But that's just my optimistic view of, of the world.
Well, thank you, Elizabeth and Margaret, for joining us today. Here's Cameo George with closing remarks.
Thank you for joining us today for this conversation exploring the evolution of fertility science. Test Tube Babies is now available to stream in full on our website and in the PBS video app for a limited time. You can watch our past forward conversations anytime on our YouTube channel or on our website. And if you liked what you saw today, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and sign up for our events newsletter. You'll be the first to know about new conversations, including our next one, examining the history of fashion in protest. Thank you again for joining us today.